what we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
The Voice to Parliament is the new agenda for Australia, and the support behind this big push is anything but grassroots. In recent weeks, Australia has come to realise that everything from the banks, trade unions, corporations, and even so-called independent news media, as well as mainstream media, supports and promotes the Voice to Parliament. In fact, according to the Financial Review, almost all of the ASX top 20 companies publicly advocate for an Indigenous voice to Parliament ahead of this year's referendum. Today I wanted to focus on what is actually behind the voice, and the truth might shock you. The extent to which this voice to Parliament poses a threat to the future of our nation cannot be understated. I ask that all of you out there are made aware of just how deep it truly goes, so be sure to share this video around. Since Australians have to vote on this, I think it's important that we realise just how dangerous this bill is. I first want to focus on some of the people behind the Voice to Parliament. Thomas Mayo is one of the biggest proponents of the Voice to Parliament. A quick glance at his profile will reveal that he is of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, who holds the position of National Indigenous Officer within the Maritime Union of Australia, an activist for Aboriginal causes, and a public voice for Indigenous constitutional recognition. Thomas Mayo has spoken publicly on many occasions and even written books about his master plan for Australia. He has outlined three main points in particular which are worthy of focus: voice, treaty, and truth. The slogan you can see being worn by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So we know where he stands. So the first point, voice. This is in reference to the Voice to Parliament, and putting it into the Constitution. Some of you might be asking, if this is just an advisory board, why does it need to be put into the Australian Constitution? Well, that's because once it's put into the Constitution, it can't be voted out. It's there to stay forever, and it can only be made stronger over time. They are laying the groundwork for more control in the future, which they openly admit to.
It's going to be very difficult once we succeed for a government to ignore this voice. It will be powerful when the people of Australia mandate that this First Nations voice must exist beyond the political cycles, because that's the goal here, is to set up a mechanism that actually exists despite the government of the day, and that's mandated by the people. So it is going to be that. This is why we've had the fight for years, because they know how powerful this will be, and that's why we're asking you to walk with us. We need the 97% to apply that political pressure.
The second point, treaty. What does this mean? Isn't this what the Communist Party and Antifa activists have written on all their posters at Black Lives Matter protests? Following the referendum, it's expected attention will shift towards the Marra-Carter Commission to work on a national process of treaty making. In fact, mainstream media reports suggest the government might move even faster. Proponents of this treaty urge that it's about giving Aboriginal people self-determination. But upon closer inspection, what does that actually mean? It's actually about the 100-year-long, well-documented communist plan of giving sovereignty to Aboriginal people, giving them land and making them a separate entity to Australia. By doing this, they would basically be a law and a nation unto themselves, which will also allow them to bring anyone into the country that they choose, including enemies of Australia, militant revolutionists from overseas, who have openly been preparing for such an event to happen. It creates a very large national security risk, especially when the CPA openly admits it's been trying to arm Aboriginals, form militias and create violent revolutions for around 100 years. A treaty would work one of two ways: balkanisation of Australia, where territories and states become fragmented, or giving the Aboriginal people right to be an apartheid-wielding dictatorship over the entire nation, where democracy means nothing. Both of these plans are extensively written about in books and websites authored by communist and socialist activists in Australia, who openly admit to spearheading this entire agenda. On top of this security risk, it also poses a question about land and resource acquisition. Thomas Mayo has claimed publicly that he wants Australia to pay reparations and rent for living on the land, meaning all of you working class people who pay rent and mortgages on your home will be forced to pay additional rent for the privilege of living on this land.
At voice architect Thomas Mayo for previously saying it will allow First Nations people to punish politicians for ignoring them.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
What we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
If you thought rental prices and inflation was bad now, you just wait. The third point that is outlined is truth, which is a reference to what they call truth-telling. They want propaganda programs and state-sanctioned brainwashing forced down the throats of Australian people about how evil white people are for being alive in this country. This weaponized indoctrination is aimed at education and media, but it also concerns the limit on freedom of speech. They want their own pseudo-history being told by Bruce Pascoe and people alike, and state-sponsored critical race theory being taught about so-called genocide of Aboriginal peoples. Yuri Bezmenov, a defector from the KGB, talks about this indoctrination process and how it's used by communists to overthrow nations.
According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages.
With all of this in mind, is it really all a coincidence that Thomas Mayo is openly pushing for what is very clearly a communist plan? No, not at all. He is a trained and fully pledged communist revolutionary. In an article written by Michael Smith, who did some fascinating research into the history of Thomas Mayo, he discovered certain information which comes of very little surprise. Thomas Mayo was the protege of Brian Manning, an MUA activist working on the Darwin Waves when a young Thomas Mayo put his hand up to be an organiser for the Maritime Union of Australia, Northern Territory branch. Quote, Brian Manning was an out-and-out communist, joining the CPA in Darwin in 1959. The following year, he was elected delegate to attend the Congress of the Communist Party of Australia. An ASIO document in 1962 reported in great detail the so-called penetration of Aboriginal organisations by communists, and detailed that in Darwin, communists, George Gibbs and Brian Manning, had helped establish the Northern Territory Aboriginal Rights Council in 1962. The focus of the struggle again shifted to independent activity of the Indigenous people themselves. And again, the Communist Party of Australia, CPA, left-wing trade unionists and socialist left offered vital support. The NTCAR, in which communist George Gibbs and Brian Mannings were leading members, played a crucial role. Gibbs was secretary of the NAWU, Militant Waterside Workers Section, whose executive had a CPA majority. Manning was a wharfie and a secretary of the CPA branch. The Darwin Waterside Workers had maintained their strong support for Aboriginal people's rights that began in the 1920s. Unquote. We have also uncovered articles both from MUA and Search Foundation, a successor to the Communist Party of Australia, where Thomas Mayo describes himself as a militant communist who seeks to overthrow the government. He has always worked closely with extremists, and he still does to this very day, which we will soon show in more detail. It should also be noted that according to the Independent Education Union of Australia,